Hi everyone, I've been experimenting with how to simulate something like a universal variable that would be accessible throughout the duration of a Business Central session, where I can exchange information easily between objects. So yes, I know that we can do a kind of call ahead or send ahead, where we are opening one object from another object, and we can, before we run the object, we can send the parameters that we are going to need ahead via a function. But sometimes the relationship isn't quite that direct. So a single instance code unit does allow us to do this, and it does work effectively. It has the advantage of being accessible from any object, so from tables, code units, reports, pages, etc. There is another method, though, that I want to experiment with, and that is making use of local storage, which is something that is available via JavaScript, and that will allow us not only to exchange data between different pages or objects, but will also allow us to maintain the values of those variables across sessions. So when my session ends, my variables will not die, but they will persist, and the next time I open my session, they will be available again. So because I'm going to be making use of JavaScript, it also means that I need to make use of control add-ins. And at this point in time, I haven't figured out how to do that with code units. So this functionality will be available only between pages, but I still think it is useful. So let's have a look. It's also quite fun just to experiment. So let's have a look at the code. Right, so I thought it might be useful to first have a look at what we are trying to achieve on the front end, and then we will have a look at the code, and I hope that the code will then make a little more sense. So starting point, I have what I call my experiment page. On my experiment page, I have added two controls, two fields, one containing text, one containing a number. There is no record behind this, so there's no source table. These are being written into global variables. As I edit the variable and move off it, it will write my variable into local storage. Then I will make use of the control add-in over here to open a second page. On opening the second page, it is going to retrieve those values out of local storage and present them to me via controls on the page, allow me to edit them. When I close the page, those variables will again have been stored into local storage. And when I come back to this page, without me having to click on anything or initiate any trigger by my own user action, it will retrieve the new values again and put them back onto this page. So let's have a look. Let's go here and type on control to Major Tom. We'll put a number in there. Open the page. Here's my new page, and I have my values in there, and we should be able to see that the number over here is equal to the number poking through from the experiment page at the back there. Let's change this now to something else. Let's type a response, Major Tom to ground control, and close the page, and there we have it, Major Tom to ground control. So two-way communication, first page to second page, change something on the second page, pass it back to the first page. I think we are now ready to have a look at the code. So to achieve what we are trying to achieve here, I'm making use of 4 files. So the first 2 will be to define 2 Business Central pages. The third will be used to define the control add-in, which is also a Business Central file. And then lastly, I have my JavaScript file. And let's have a look first at the Business Central page, the starting page. This will be the first page that I open. Under my content area over here, I have defined 2 field controls. One is called page text and the other is called page decimal. And these will receive inputs into variables of the same name. They are global variables, not linked to any record or underlying table. And then I lastly have my user control, which I have given the name global text and which is linked to the control add-in global text box, which is defined in my file over here, control add-in global text box. I'm now going to jump into the JavaScript file, and I want to talk about this function over here called retrieve local storage. So this is essentially the heart of what we are trying to do to exchange data between the 2 pages. And this is going to be used to open global storage, retrieve variables out of local storage, and place them into usable variables within my JavaScript file. So I have declared global variables up here, global text, global num, and in my function for the two variables, I am making use of local storage and the function or the method defined for local storage called getItem. I supply it a key, which for the first one is this thing over here called global text val. So that will go and look in local storage for this as a key. As it happens, if I'm running this on a system for the very first time, that key will not exist in local storage. So what happens is the system will return a null value, which JavaScript will be very happy with, but Business Central most certainly will not be happy with. So if I try and pass this variable called global text to my Business Central page, it will actually crash and give an error. To get around this, I have a trap here to say if global text equals null, then give it a default value. In this case, it is new. And then I do the similar thing for the other variable, global num. I use the key over here, global text num. So I will retrieve that from local storage. If it does not exist, it will return null. And then I will check for null. And if it is null, I will assign the default value 0 to it. So the first time I run this page, it will contain the values new and 0 on my input fields. At this point, I will have my page open and I will be able to capture my information into my two fields. I then need to save it back into my local storage. And how do I do that? Well, I have got two functions defined here called save text and save num. Each of them does exactly one thing. Using the object local storage, I use the method setItem, and this time it takes two variables. So the first is to give it the key, global text val, same as the key that I have used up there, and then the variable inText, which is a parameter being sent from wherever this will be called from. So that will receive the variable inText. Whatever is in text will then be stored against the key global text val in my local storage. And then I do exactly the same thing for the number. So it will take a value in text, bearing in mind, of course, JavaScript doesn't really care about data types. We don't declare data types. It will receive whatever is contained in that variable in text, and it will save it under the key global text num, and that then becomes available when I want to retrieve it again. So these functions I will use from both pages. So my initial page, when I open it, I will retrieve the local storage. I will present that onto my page. The user will edit it if they choose, and that will cause these two functions to run and to write it back into local storage. When I open my second page, I will use this function again, the same function on my second page, to retrieve what is stored in local storage and put it onto my second page. When the user edits on the second page, the same thing will happen. It will run save text or save num, save the variables back into my local storage, and return to the first page. The first page, when it refreshes, will again use retrieve local storage to find the keys and put them back onto the page. I now need to plug all of this together and make sure that all the moving parts function as a cohesive whole. And my starting point is going to be my page. So the page is going to open, and it is going to place onto the page my user control. In other words, the control add-in called over here global text box. So let's just select that. I'm giving it the name global text. It will create the control add-in global text box into which I have placed all of my events and my procedures. So remember that events are used to communicate from JavaScript to Business Central, and procedures are used to communicate from Business Central to JavaScript. When the user control is placed on the page, that is going to start the process of JavaScript executing its code. And it will execute whatever code I have defined outside of my functions. So just these first few lines up to line 8. What are we doing here? Well, we are declaring our global variables. We are declaring a constant called BC, which will point to the object Microsoft Dynamics Nav to allow me to a little bit more easily use the invoke extensibility method to instantiate events between Business Central and JavaScript. The first one here, invoke extensibility method, send text ready, is going to give me a link to the event declared in my control add-in over here, which in turn is going to allow Business Central to respond via a trigger on the control add-in. So back to the page, here is my link to the control add-in. Here is my trigger, send text ready, and that is simply going to do this one command. So using the object current page, the control global text, which is here, linked to global text box. It is going to then run the procedure set control, no parameters. Go back over here to the procedure declared, set control, which will then in turn tell it to go and look for the function of the same name in my JavaScript. So by doing this, the end result is that my function set control is going to run. When that has run, it is going to run the function update this page. Update this page, what is that going to do? Well, that is going to go down here and retrieve my variables from storage, from local storage, and send them to the Business Central page. But we are getting ahead of ourselves here, so let's go back to the first one. Send text ready is going to result in this function running. And what is this doing? It is simply making my control visible on the page. So it is going to give it some shape and color, and then I'm going to place some text into the control so that I can communicate to the user what they need to do. And then lastly, I'm going to give it an on-click event. So when the user clicks on the control with their mouse, it is in turn going to cause this function to run over here, these two lines, again creating an event. So I am now creating an event called open page, which is declared over here. And that is obviously going to allow Business Central to respond to my click. So when the user says open page, it is going to go over here to the event, and that will in turn allow the trigger open page to run. And that will do a very simple command, very familiar. It is going to open my second page. When it returns, so when I have finished doing whatever I want to do on my second page, it is going to return via this instruction over here, and it is going to run my callback method, which is defined as part of the onClick, and that is then going to rerun this thing called update this page, which is by now fairly familiar. So let's have a proper look at update page. Retrieve local storage we have already covered. It is also going to use another event. This time we are calling it send local storage to page. And you'll note that we are sending it some parameters. We are sending it two parameters, global text and global num, which at this point will contain the values that I retrieved from my local storage. So send local storage to page will of course be declared somewhere over here as an event. Note the variables. So here I am receiving two variables. I have called them outText and outNum, and they correspond to the two things which are sitting in these square brackets. Why are we sending these in square brackets? Because we have to send them as an array. Don't ask why, just do it. So the name of the event is send local storage to page. The variables are sent as an array containing two called global text and global num. Those will end up over here in outText and outNum, and they will of course allow Business Central to respond. So going back to Business Central, we will find trigger on our user control over there, and that will simply do the following. It will take my incoming variables received again as outText and outNum. I've used the same names. They don't have to be the same names as I have on my event declaration, and it will then move those into the global variables for the page called page text and page decimal. Page text and page decimal are, of course, the values that I'm using, or the variables that I'm using to capture and to display in my field controls over here. So my field page text will now contain and display whatever JavaScript has retrieved from local storage. If it's the first time I'm running it, it will contain the value new. If it is the second time I'm running it, or any time thereafter, it is going to contain whatever was the last value captured. And I will now be back in control on my page, and I can start editing. So if I now go and edit this control, so I'll go and type in a new value, that is going to cause the normal Business Central onValidate trigger to occur. And now this is going to do a callback again to JavaScript via current page, via my user control called global text, which is up here, which is of course pointing to my control add-in called global text box, and it is going to look for the procedure save text. So that is a procedure. It is used to send data back to JavaScript. Here is my procedure, save text. Note that it is receiving a parameter. Here I'm sending it the variable page text from this page. It is received here as in text, and it will now look for a JavaScript function of the same name. Here it is over here. Again, takes one parameter. I don't have to declare the type because this is JavaScript. And JavaScript will then respond by running one command, localStorage, method set item, key global text val, and provide it the value in text. So long story short, what it is going to do is user is going to type something into this control over here to be received into the variable page text. Page text will be transferred via a call to the control add-in save text to the function save text in JavaScript, and it will find itself back in its little cubbyhole in local storage. Similarly for the decimal, so control, user will type a number into the field page decimal. Page decimal will then run the onValidate trigger and pass its value back via the procedure save num, which is sitting over here on my control add-in, which will look for the function in JavaScript of the same name, save num, and place that value back into its cubbyhole global text num. Quick recap of what we have managed to achieve in our application. So we have our page open. We have retrieved our values from the local storage. We have placed them on the page via these field controls over here. Our control add-in is a little button over here, nice and visible. And when I click that, it is going to open my second page. Let's go back and have a look at what happens on the second page in the code. Second page, I again have two input controls, page text, page decimal, and I have my user control. I happen to have given it a different name this time, but it is pointing back to the exact same control add-in. So I'm using one control add-in for both pages. This time though, I am only going to use one trigger. So let's go back and see what happens. When the page opens, the control add-in is going to be placed on the page. And I know that you are now going to ask me, where is it? Because we can't see it. It is there. In this case, I don't want to be able to interact directly with the control add-in. So I have not given it any format. It is not visible, but it is there. So when I go back to my code, the control add-in has been placed on the page, and that is then going to cause my JavaScript to run again. And it is going to start at the beginning again. So what we have to understand is that this is a second instance of the same JavaScript code. It's two separate user controls. So there's a user control pointing to global text on my first page, another user control on the second page. They do use the same base object, which is global text box, which means that they are using the same JavaScript code, but they are two independent instances and they function independently of one another. So when my second page opens and my second user control is created, as with the first page, it is going to cause these first 8 lines to run. Line 6 is effectively not going to do anything because on my second page, I'm choosing not to respond to this event. So I'm not using it at all. Nothing will happen. But what is very important is it will run this piece of code here that says update this page. Should be familiar by now. It is going to retrieve my data from local storage, and then it is going to create the event, send local storage to page over here. And that will allow my second page now to respond to that event. And what is that going to do? It is going to come and run this trigger over here. And that is going to retrieve my variables that I have got from local storage and place them in the variables for this specific page. My user will now have control. They will go and edit the fields if they choose to. What happens if they edit the field? Well, it's going to do exactly the same as we did on our first page. It will cause the onValidate trigger to run. The onValidate trigger will then, via a procedure on my control add-in, send the input value that I have just updated as page text back to the procedure over here, save text on the control add-in, which will in turn look for a function of the same name over here and put my new value back into storage. Same with the other input control, page decimal. When I close my page, this instance and this user control will cease to exist. They will die, but the values that I had captured will be maintained in the local storage fields. Right, so once I close my page, my control returns to the first page, and we do the reverse process. So what will have happened now is control will have in fact returned to this piece of code over here, and it will now execute my callback function, update this page. And update this page is of course very familiar to us by now. It is again going to go and retrieve local storage. This time, however, what will be in local storage will be whatever has been placed there by page 2. And it will pull them back in, put them back into my variables global text and global num, and lastly send global text and global num back again via send local storage to page. They will end up through this event going back to the first page's input controls, and it will now reflect the values from the second page. I hope that makes sense. Let's just recap again. What does it do in practice? Let's go back to our application. This is my first page that I opened. This is my first page. 1, 2, 3. Open page. There it is. This is my first page. And I'm going to type returning to page 1, 4, 5, 6. Close the page, and voila, there they are. Right, so a lot of backwards and forwardsing, lots of code in and out. But to recap on the code, 2 pages, 1 control add-in. On each page, I have got input fields. And once I type something into those input fields, I am using local storage to save them. Each time I move from one page to the other, it will be retrieving those values out of local storage and redisplaying them on the page for me to edit and update. My advice with this is follow it step by step. If you'd like the code, please drop a note in the comments below, and I will see what I can do to make it available to you. Cheers for now.